tell you where they are, but it's going to cost you $10,000 a head. Cash. No tax.
This deal remains the most hated deal in legal history. While families wept for their missing children, Clifford Olson sat in a police cruiser eating a ham sandwich and laughing, negotiating the price of their remains. He wasn't just a serial killer, he was a salesman of the macabre. For months, he wasn't hiding in the woods or living under a false name. He was walking freely through British Columbia, visiting stores and talking to neighbors, all while holding a secret that paralyzed the West Coast. Olson didn't just take lives, he enjoyed the control. He enjoyed watching authority fail. He turned human suffering into a currency, forcing the state to pay a ransom for the dead just to give grieving parents a body to bury. This is not just the story of a spree killer. This is the story of how a system was exploited, how warning signs were ignored, and how we struck a bargain with a monster. Clifford Robert Olson Jr. was born on January 1, 1940, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. From the very beginning, his life showed signs of instability. His home environment was chaotic. His father, Clifford Olson Sr., worked as a milkman and struggled with alcoholism. His mother was described as emotionally distant, unable to provide consistent nurturing or boundaries. Discipline was inconsistent. Emotional boundaries were weak or non-existent. But what separated Olson from other troubled children was not hardship alone. It was behavior. At a very young age, Clifford showed patterns that alarmed teachers, family members, and later authorities. He lied constantly, not to avoid punishment, but because he enjoyed it. He stole things he didn't need, not for survival, but for the thrill. And when confronted, he showed no guilt, no fear, no remorse. By age 9, Olson was already exhibiting cruelty toward animals, a well-documented early warning sign in psychological research. Neighbors reported incidents of him harming neighborhood pets, behavior he displayed without apparent emotion. School became another arena for concern. Teachers noted that Clifford was intelligent but manipulative. He would lie about assignments, forge notes from his parents, and blame classmates for things he had done. One teacher recalled, "He was the kind of child who could look you directly in the eye and tell you a complete fabrication without blinking, and he seemed to enjoy watching you believe him." Psychologists later noted that Olson displayed early antisocial traits, the kind that do not fade with age. They harden. By age 12, Olson had his first documented contact with police, caught breaking into a store after hours. When questioned, he showed no nervousness. Instead, he spoke confidently, offered excuses, and attempted to manipulate the officers into believing someone else was responsible. This pattern would repeat itself dozens of times over the next several years. By his teenage years, Olson was already known to police. Petty theft, break-ins, fraud, vandalism. Each arrest followed the same pattern. He would deny responsibility, blame someone else, portray himself as misunderstood. To Olson, consequences were not lessons, they were inconveniences. At age 17, he was sent to a juvenile detention facility. Staff members noted his behavior: manipulative, charming when it suited him, and completely devoid of genuine emotion. One counselor wrote in his file, "Subject displays superficial charm but lacks empathy, does not respond to rehabilitation efforts, appears to view incarceration as a game." This assessment would prove chillingly accurate. As Olson entered adulthood, crime was no longer something he did, it was who he was. He drifted from job to job, never staying long enough to build stability. He worked briefly as a laborer, a salesman, a driver, but none of these roles lasted. Money problems followed him everywhere, but instead of working to solve them, he stole. He forged checks, committed scams, manipulated employers. Between 1957 and 1981, Clifford Olson was arrested over 90 times. The charges ranged from theft and fraud to impaired driving, assault, and burglary. And yet, he spent relatively little time behind bars. This is critical to understand. Despite his extensive criminal record, the justice system repeatedly released him. Parole was granted, sentences were reduced, opportunities for rehabilitation were offered. Each time, Olson manipulated the process. He would express remorse he didn't feel. He would promise change he had no intention of making. He would tell parole officers exactly what they wanted to hear. And each time he was caught, he learned. Prison did not scare Clifford Olson. It fascinated him. Behind bars, he studied people, not books, people. He watched guards, inmates, parole officers. He learned how authority spoke, how it reacted, and how easily it could be provoked or deceived. He learned the language of rehabilitation, the phrases that signaled progress, the behaviors that earned early release. More importantly, he learned something crucial. Systems are predictable, and predictable systems can be exploited. One former inmate later recalled Olson's behavior in prison. "He wasn't like the other guys. Most of us just wanted to do our time and get out. Cliff studied everything. He watched the guards, figured out their routines, learned who was weak, who was strict. He treated it like school." While other inmates tried to survive prison, Olson treated it like training. When he was released, he didn't leave prison behind. He took its lessons with him. And with each release, his confidence grew. By the late 1970s, Olson had become convinced of something dangerous, that he was smarter than the system designed to contain him. This belief would fuel everything that came next. To the outside world, Clifford Olson eventually appeared to settle down. In 1980, at the age of 40, he married Joan Hale, a woman he had met through mutual acquaintances. Joan was described as quiet, trusting, and unaware of the full extent of Olson's criminal past. Shortly after their marriage, Joan became pregnant. Their son was born in April 1981. To neighbors, Olson presented himself as a family man. He spoke about his child. He talked about work. He appeared, on the surface, to be building a conventional life. This phase of his life is critical to understand, because it is where many people assume change occurred. It didn't. This was not rehabilitation. It was camouflage. Olson learned that normalcy was the perfect disguise. A man with a family doesn't raise suspicion. A man with responsibilities is rarely questioned. Neighbors saw nothing alarming. Employers saw nothing threatening. One neighbor later recalled, "He seemed like a regular guy. A little chatty maybe, but nothing that made you think twice. He'd wave when you drove by, talk about his kid. He seemed proud." But beneath that surface, nothing had changed. Olson was still committing crimes, still manipulating people, still lying without effort. During this period, he was involved in multiple fraudulent schemes. He scammed welfare programs, he forged documents, he stole from employers who trusted him. And beyond the financial crimes, something darker was developing. Olson began spending more time driving around lower-income neighborhoods. He frequented areas where children were present, near schools, parks, transit stops. He observed patterns. He noted where children walked alone. He identified moments of vulnerability. This wasn't casual, it was reconnaissance. The difference now was confidence. He believed he had beaten the system. And once a man like Olson reaches that conclusion, the escalation begins. By the late 1970s, Olson's criminal behavior began to shift. The thefts were no longer enough. The scams no longer satisfied him. Psychologists describe this phase as fantasy escalation. The offender begins imagining acts that provide greater control, greater risk, and greater reward. For Olson, control was everything. He wanted to dominate, to manipulate, to prove superiority. And, most dangerously, he wanted victims who could be easily overpowered and easily silenced. Children fit that profile. They trusted adults, they obeyed authority, and they lacked the ability to defend themselves. This realization marked a turning point, not an impulsive snap, but a deliberate choice. During this time, Olson began testing boundaries. He would approach children under false pretenses, offering help, asking for directions, posing as someone in authority. He studied their reactions. He learned what worked. In several documented instances before the known offenses began, witnesses reported seeing Olson speaking to children in parks or near schools. At the time, these interactions seemed innocent. Only later would their significance become clear. Olson also began collecting items that would later be used in his crimes: rope, tape, tools. These were not purchased impulsively. They were acquired methodically, over time. He was preparing. And as his fantasies intensified, the gap between imagination and action narrowed. When children began disappearing across British Columbia in late 1980 and early 1981, the cases did not initially appear connected. Different neighborhoods, different ages, different circumstances. But something was forming beneath the surface, a pattern that no one yet saw. The first confirmed victim was Christine Weller, a 12-year-old girl who disappeared on November 17, 1980, in Surrey, British Columbia. Christine had been spending time with friends near a shopping area when she vanished. Her body was discovered on Christmas Day, 1980, in a wooded area in Surrey. At the time, police had no suspects, no witnesses, no clear motive. To the public, it appeared to be a tragic, isolated incident. But it wasn't. Over the following months, more children went missing. January 1981, Darren Johnsrud, 16, disappeared in Coquitlam. April 1981, Colleen Daignault, 13, vanished in Surrey. Parents searched, police investigated, posters were printed, and Clifford Olson watched. He followed the news coverage closely. He listened to police statements. He observed public fear. This to him was validation. Each unanswered question confirmed his belief that he was untouchable. And instead of retreating, he grew bolder. By the summer of 1981, the disappearances accelerated. Between July and August 1981, multiple children went missing in rapid succession across the Lower Mainland. Parents grew frantic. Communities were paralyzed with fear. Police were overwhelmed. And through it all, Olson maintained his facade of normalcy. He went to work. He came home to his wife and infant son. He appeared concerned when neighbors discussed the missing children. No one suspected him. Most offenders try to avoid attention. Clifford Olson did the opposite. He wanted recognition, not as a criminal, but as a player in control. He believed police needed him, that families would beg him, that the truth gave him power. And this mindset would lead to one of the most disturbing chapters in Canadian criminal history. Because Clifford Olson was not finished, he was just getting started. And the worst part of his story had not yet been revealed. As summer 1981 continued, the body count rose. The fear intensified. And somewhere in the background, Clifford Olson was preparing for his next move, a move that would shock the nation and redefine the limits of human cruelty. To understand what Clifford Olson became, you have to stop thinking in terms of rage or impulse. Olson was not driven by sudden anger. He was not out of control. He was deliberate. Psychologists who later studied him did not describe madness. They described calculation. Clifford Olson understood exactly what he was doing, and that understanding is what makes his crimes so deeply disturbing. He did not act because he lost control. He acted because he wanted control. This distinction matters because it changes how we understand prevention, detection, and response. When people imagine dangerous individuals, they often picture chaos, rage, instability. But some of the most dangerous people are calm, patient, methodical. Clifford Olson was all three. Clifford Olson fit nearly every clinical marker of psychopathy, not the Hollywood version, but the real one. He showed a complete lack of empathy, shallow emotional responses, chronic pathological lying, manipulative charm, grandiosity, and an inflated sense of self-worth, no remorse or guilt, impulsivity combined with strategic planning, parasitic lifestyle, exploiting others for personal gain. But unlike many offenders, Olson was not explosive. He was calm, measured, patient. This is important because calm predators are often the hardest to detect. Olson could speak convincingly about anything. He could cry on command. He could express concern without feeling it. To him, emotions were tools, and people were instruments. Dr. Roy O'Shaughnessy, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Olson, noted, "He displayed classic psychopathic traits. There was no evidence of psychosis, delusion, or diminished capacity. He knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway." This assessment is critical because it confirms that Olson was not mentally ill in the legal sense. He was criminally responsible. His mind was not broken. It was wired for predation. At the core of Clifford Olson's personality was one overwhelming need: dominance. He needed to feel superior, smarter, untouchable. This is why simple crimes eventually stopped satisfying him. Stealing money gave temporary relief. Manipulating employers gave a short thrill. But domination over another human being, especially one who trusted him, gave something far more powerful: total control. For Olson, children represented the ultimate imbalance of power. They trusted adults. They followed instructions, and they could be silenced. This wasn't random, it was strategic. Olson later admitted in interviews that he specifically targeted children because they were easier to manipulate. He said, without emotion, that children were more trusting and less likely to resist. This cold assessment reveals the depth of his predatory mindset. To him, vulnerability was opportunity. Clifford Olson did not stalk in the way people imagine. He did not lurk endlessly in shadows. Instead, he observed opportunity. He watched playgrounds, transit routes, neighborhoods where children moved freely. He looked for moments of isolation, a child walking alone, a moment without supervision, a brief window where trust could be exploited. He also targeted children from vulnerable backgrounds. Many of his victims came from working-class families. Some were from single-parent homes. Some had experienced instability. This was not coincidental. Olson understood that children without consistent supervision were less likely to be immediately reported missing. He relied on authority, not force. A confident voice. A simple instruction. A lie told with certainty. He would approach children and say he was helping their parents, or that he was a police officer, or that he needed assistance. This method reduced resistance, reduced noise, reduced risk. And to Olson, risk management was everything. Long before Olson committed his crimes, he rehearsed them in his mind. This is a known phenomenon in predatory offenders. They imagine scenarios repeatedly. They refine details. They anticipate outcomes. By the time they act, the behavior feels familiar. Olson fantasized about control, silence, outsmarting authority. The crimes were not spontaneous. They were rehearsed performances. And after each one, instead of fear, Olson felt reinforcement. He had succeeded. And success breeds escalation. Psychologists who studied Olson's case noted that his fantasies became progressively more elaborate over time. Early criminal behavior involved theft and fraud, acts of control, but without direct violence. As his confidence grew, so did the intensity of his fantasies. By the time he began harming children, he had mentally prepared for years. This is why intervention at earlier stages is so critical. Because once fantasy becomes action, stopping the cycle becomes exponentially harder. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Clifford Olson's psychology was his sense of entitlement. He believed he was owed something, not forgiveness, not understanding, but power. He believed he deserved attention. He believed police needed him. He believed families would eventually beg him. This entitlement is what separates Olson from many other offenders. It is why he contacted police, why he taunted them, why he negotiated. To Olson, the crimes were leverage, and leverage was currency. In recorded conversations with investigators, Olson repeatedly referred to himself as the only one who knows and the one with the answers. He would say things like, "You need me more than I need you." This wasn't bravado, it was genuine belief. Olson truly saw himself as the central figure in a narrative where everyone else, police, families, the public, were secondary characters. This grandiosity extended to his personal life as well. Even with his wife, Olson positioned himself as superior. He controlled finances, he controlled information, he controlled the narrative of their relationship. Joan Olson later described feeling isolated and manipulated, though she claimed she had no knowledge of his crimes until after his arrest. Clifford Olson did not fear capture. He feared losing control of the narrative. He wanted to decide when information was released, how much police knew, what families learned. By inserting himself into the investigation, he reversed the power dynamic. Police weren't hunting him, they were reacting to him, and that illusion of control was intoxicating. This is evidenced by his behavior once suspicion began to focus on him. Rather than flee or go silent, Olson escalated contact with authorities. He called investigators, he sent letters, he hinted at information. In one instance, he approached an RCMP officer directly and offered assistance with the missing children cases, all while actively committing crimes. This brazen behavior is a hallmark of certain psychopathic offenders, the need to be at the center of the story, even if it increases their risk of capture. But illusions do not last forever, because while Olson believed he was directing the game, the walls were already closing in. As Olson continued his manipulations, small cracks began to appear. His confidence became arrogance, his lies grew bolder, his need for recognition intensified. He started to believe he was untouchable, and that belief would become his greatest mistake. Because the same traits that allowed Clifford Olson to operate freely were the traits that would eventually expose him. His need to talk, his need to be seen, his need to control the narrative. All of it would lead investigators directly to him. By August 1981, police had begun to focus their attention on a single suspect, a man with a long criminal record, a man who had been seen in the areas where children disappeared, a man who couldn't stop talking about the case: Clifford Olson. The game was changing, and for the first time, Clifford Olson was not in full control. What he didn't yet realize was that the end was already in motion, and when it came, it would come swiftly. By 1980, fear was no longer isolated. It spread quietly, from town to town, from family to family. Children were disappearing across British Columbia. At first, police treated the cases as individual incidents: runaways, accidents, miscommunication. This is not uncommon. Serial crimes rarely announce themselves clearly at the beginning. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Clifford Olson was becoming more confident. Each successful abduction reinforced the same belief: no one was connecting the dots. And as long as no one connected the dots, he was free. The timeline of disappearances painted a disturbing picture. November 17th, 1980. Christine Weller, 12, disappeared from Surrey. Her body was found on Christmas Day, 1980. April 16th, 1981. Colleen Daignault, 13, vanished from Surrey. April 22nd, 1981. Darren Johnsrud, 16, went missing in Coquitlam. May 19th, 1981. Sandra Wolfsteiner, 16, disappeared from Langley. And then, in the summer of 1981, the pace accelerated dramatically. Between July and August, the disappearances came in rapid succession. The Lower Mainland was gripped by panic. Parents were terrified. Children were kept indoors. Communities were paralyzed. And through it all, Clifford Olson maintained his mask of normalcy. Clifford Olson did not rely on brute force. That was too risky. Instead, he relied on authority and deception. He spoke calmly, confidently, as if he belonged. Sometimes he offered help. Sometimes he gave instructions. Sometimes he simply acted like someone who had the right to intervene. Children, taught to respect adults, complied. This is one of the most difficult truths in cases like this. The very rules designed to protect children can be exploited by predators. Olson understood this, and he used it repeatedly. His typical approach: he would drive slowly through neighborhoods, looking for children walking alone or waiting for buses. He would pull over and strike up a conversation. He presented himself as friendly, helpful, and trustworthy. He claimed to know their parents. He offered rides. He said he was with law enforcement. He created urgency. "Your mum asked me to pick you up," or "There's been an emergency." Once a child entered his vehicle, the situation changed. Olson would drive to remote locations, wooded areas, isolated roads, places far from witnesses. What happened next was calculated and methodical. He did not act impulsively. He followed a pattern. The case of Judy Cosma, 14. On July 9th, 1981, Judy Cosma was last seen in New Westminster, British Columbia. Judy was described by her family as outgoing, responsible, and cautious. She was not the type of child who would go with strangers easily. But Clifford Olson did not approach her as a stranger. According to later confessions and investigative findings, Olson approached Judy while she was waiting at a bus stop. He identified himself as someone connected to law enforcement and told her there had been an incident involving her family. Faced with what seemed like an emergency, Judy got into his car. Olson drove her to a secluded area near Weaver Lake, a remote location often used for camping and hiking, but largely deserted on weekdays. Once there, Olson restrained Judy using materials he had pre-prepared: rope and tape, tools he carried with him specifically for this purpose. What followed was an act of profound cruelty. Olson did not act in rage. He acted with deliberation. He maintained control throughout. He wanted her to know that resistance was futile. Judy Cosma was found later, her body left in a wooded area. The cause of her passing was consistent with blunt force trauma and restraint-related injuries. The investigators noted that her hands had been bound, indicating she had been restrained for a period of time before her life ended. This detail was significant. It showed that Olson's crimes were not impulsive. He took time. He prolonged the experience. He maintained dominance. The case of Raymond King Jr. 15. Raymond King Jr., known to friends as Ray, disappeared on July 23, 1981, from New Westminster. Ray was a teenager who loved sports and spent much of his time outdoors. He was last seen riding his bicycle near a shopping area. Clifford Olson approached Ray under the guise of offering him work. According to Olson's later statements, he told Ray that he was hiring young men for yard work and odd jobs. He offered cash payment and said the work would only take a few hours. Ray, like many teenagers looking to earn money during the summer, agreed. Olson drove Ray to a remote area near Deroche, a small community east of Mission, British Columbia. Once there, Olson's demeanor changed. He restrained Ray, using pre-positioned materials in his vehicle. He then proceeded to carry out an act of violence that was methodical and prolonged. Ray's body was discovered weeks later in a wooded area. Investigators found evidence that he had been struck multiple times with a blunt object. His injuries indicated a sustained and deliberate effort to end his life. The location of Ray's body was significant. It was far from where he was last seen, over 50 kilometers away. This indicated that Olson had planned the route, knew the area, and had selected the location in advance. This was not random. It was premeditated. The case of Sigrun Arnd, 18. A young woman, not a child. While most of Clifford Olson's victims were children, one case stands out because the victim was slightly older. Sigrun Arnd was an 18-year-old German student visiting Canada. She was staying with a host family in Surrey and working part-time while improving her English. On July 25, 1981, Sigrun was hitchhiking, a common practice at the time, though one that carried inherent risk. Clifford Olson picked her up. According to his later confessions, Olson engaged Sigrun in conversation, presented himself as friendly and helpful, and offered to drive her to her destination. Instead, he drove her to a remote area near Weaver Lake. What happened next followed Olson's established pattern: restraint, control, and violence. Sigrun's body was discovered later in the summer. The cause of her passing was blunt force trauma. Her hands had been bound. The fact that Olson targeted an adult woman, not just children, indicated something important. His crimes were not exclusively driven by a preference for young victims. They were driven by opportunity and control. Sigrun was vulnerable because she was alone, in an unfamiliar country, and had accepted a ride from someone she believed was safe. Olson exploited that vulnerability without hesitation. With each crime, Olson refined his approach. He learned what worked, what didn't, what increased risk. There was no emotional fallout for him, no guilt, no hesitation, only calculation. Psychologists later noted that Olson did not relive the crimes with shame. He relived them with analysis. What he could do better next time, what mistakes to avoid, how to maintain control. This mindset is critical to understand, because it explains why he didn't stop. Between July and August 1981, the pace of disappearances was staggering. July 2nd, 1981, Simon Partington, 9, vanished from Surrey. July 9th, 1981, Judy Cosma, 14, disappeared from New Westminster. July 23rd, 1981, Raymond King Jr., 15, went missing from New Westminster. July 25th, 1981, Sigrun Arnd, 18, disappeared near Surrey. July 27th, 1981, Terry Lynn Carson, 15, vanished from Surrey. August 12th, 1981. Louise Chartrand, 17, disappeared from Maple Ridge. Each case followed a similar pattern. Each victim was last seen in a public place. Each disappeared without a trace. And each time, Clifford Olson returned home to his wife and infant son as if nothing had happened. What made Clifford Olson's crimes even more horrifying was what he did after the abductions. He didn't just take lives, he tormented families. Olson made phone calls to the parents of missing children. He sent letters. He claimed to have information. And then he demanded money. The Johnsrud family. One of the most disturbing examples involved the family of Darren Johnsrud, a 16-year-old boy who disappeared in April 1981. After Darren went missing, his family was desperate for answers. They distributed flyers. They contacted police repeatedly. They appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for information. And then they received a phone call. The caller claimed to know where Darren was. He said Darren was alive, but in danger. He said that for a sum of money, he could arrange for Darren's safe return. The family, desperate and terrified, considered paying. But the caller's demands kept changing. First, he wanted $10,000, then $25,000. Then he claimed Darren was being held by a group and the amount needed to increase. The family reported the calls to police, who attempted to trace them. But the calls were brief, made from payphones, and impossible to track in real time with the technology available in 1981. The calls eventually stopped. Weeks later, Darren Johnsrud's body was discovered in a wooded area near DeRoche. When Clifford Olson was eventually arrested and confessed, investigators confirmed that he had been the one making those calls. He had contacted the Johnsrud family while their son was already deceased. He had given them false hope. He had extorted their grief. He had turned their suffering into a game. When asked why he did this, Olson showed no remorse. He said simply, "I wanted to see if they would pay." Other families targeted. The Johnsrud family was not the only one. Investigators later discovered that Olson had made similar calls to at least 3 other families. In one case, he contacted the parents of a missing girl and claimed that she was being held by a group of men and that he could negotiate her release for money. The parents, frantic, began gathering funds. But before they could make payment arrangements, police intervened and warned them that the calls were likely a cruel hoax. Olson's behavior during this period reveals something deeply disturbing about his psychology. He did not just want to commit crimes, he wanted to extract maximum suffering from every situation. The ransom calls were not about money. Olson was already receiving welfare assistance, and his material needs were minimal. The calls were about power, about watching families suffer, about knowing that he controlled their hope. As disappearances mounted, law enforcement began comparing notes. Patterns emerged. Age similarities. Most victims were between 9 and 18 years old. Geographic overlap. Most disappearances occurred in the Lower Mainland. Behavioral consistencies. Victims were last seen in public places, often near transit stops. Still, evidence was limited. There were no witnesses, no physical links, no clear suspect. And while police worked, parents waited. Each day without answers was another day of agony. Unbeknownst to them, the man responsible was watching all of it unfold. By midsummer 1981, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, formed a task force dedicated to investigating the disappearances. Investigators began reviewing recent reports, cross-referencing known offenders, and interviewing witnesses. One name began appearing repeatedly in their files: Clifford Olson. Olson had been questioned multiple times in connection with unrelated incidents. His vehicle had been spotted near locations where children had disappeared. Witnesses reported seeing him speaking to young people in parks and near schools. but there was no direct evidence linking him to any specific crime. Under Canadian law, suspicion alone was not enough for arrest. Police needed proof, and so they began surveillance. During this period, Clifford Olson exhibited behaviors that were unusual even among offenders. He inserted himself into investigations. Olson didn't just watch the investigations from a distance. He actively inserted himself into them. He approached RCMP officers directly and offered to help. He claimed to have street connections and said he could gather information that police couldn't access. In one documented instance, Olson visited an RCMP detachment and spoke with investigators about the missing children cases. He provided tips, some accurate, some fabricated, and positioned himself as a concerned citizen. This behavior is rare, but not unheard of among certain offenders. It reflects a deep need for control and attention. Olson wanted to be part of the narrative. He wanted to watch police react to information only he possessed. He collected news clippings. When Olson was eventually arrested, police searched his residence. Inside, they found a disturbing collection. Newspaper clippings about the missing children, folded and stored in a box. Some articles were highlighted. Others had handwritten notes in the margins. This behavior indicated that Olson was not just committing crimes, he was documenting them, reliving them, studying the public response. Psychologists later noted that this type of collection is common among offenders who derive satisfaction from the aftermath of their actions. The clippings were trophies, evidence of impact, proof that he mattered. He bragged to inmates. During brief periods of incarceration for unrelated offenses, Olson made comments to fellow inmates that later became significant. One inmate reported that Olson had boasted about getting away with things and had made vague references to knowing where bodies were. At the time, these comments were dismissed as empty bravado. Many inmates make exaggerated claims to build reputations. But in hindsight, Olson's comments were confessions hidden in plain sight. He brought his wife and infant son to crime scenes. One of the most chilling details uncovered during the investigation was that Clifford Olson had, on at least 2 occasions, brought his wife Joan and their infant son to locations where he had committed crimes. According to Joan's later testimony, Olson would suggest family drives to scenic areas. He would stop near wooded locations, claiming he wanted to enjoy the view or check on a piece of land. What Joan didn't know was that these locations were disposal sites. Olson was returning to the scenes, reliving the crimes, and he was doing it with his family present. This behavior reflects an extraordinary level of compartmentalization. Olson was able to separate his identity as a husband and father from his identity as an offender without any apparent internal conflict. Then something changed. Clifford Olson contacted police directly. At first, the communication was subtle. Hints, suggestions, information that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. He called the RCMP tip line multiple times. He claimed to have information about the missing children. He said he had heard things and wanted to help. For investigators, this raised alarms. Only someone close to the crimes could possess such details. But Olson didn't stop there. He escalated. In one phone call, he told investigators, "You're looking in the wrong places. I can tell you where to look." When asked how he knew, he replied, "I just know." Detectives attempted to trace the calls, but Olson was careful. He used payphones. He kept conversations brief. He never stayed on the line long enough to be tracked. Still, His need to communicate was his weakness. Each call added to the profile investigators were building. Each conversation revealed more about his psychology. And slowly, police began to realize this wasn't just a witness. This was the offender. By late July 1981, the RCMP placed Clifford Olson under active surveillance. Officers followed his vehicle. They documented his movements. They noted the places he visited. What they observed was deeply concerning. Olson continued to drive through neighborhoods where children were present. He stopped frequently near schools and parks. He approached young people and struck up conversations. On one occasion, surveillance officers watched as Olson pulled over near a group of teenagers waiting at a bus stop. He rolled down his window and spoke to them for several minutes. When the teens walked away, Olson drove off. Officers later interviewed the teenagers. They said a man in a car had offered them money for yard work and had tried to convince them to get into his vehicle. They described the man's appearance, his vehicle, his demeanor. It matched Clifford Olson perfectly. Police now had enough to bring him in for questioning. On August 12, 1981, Clifford Olson was arrested. But the arrest almost didn't happen. Due to legal restrictions, police could not hold Olson without formal charges. And without direct physical evidence linking him to a specific crime, formal charges were difficult to file. Olson knew this, and he used it to his advantage. During initial questioning, he was calm, cooperative, and manipulative. He denied any involvement in the disappearances. He provided alibis. He suggested that police were harassing him because of his criminal record. He even threatened legal action for wrongful detention. For a brief moment, it seemed Olson might walk free. But then, investigators made a breakthrough. While Olson was being questioned, forensic teams searched his vehicle. Inside, they found fibers matching clothing worn by two victims, bloodstains in the trunk area, a map with markings near remote locations, personal items belonging to missing children. This was the evidence police needed. Confronted with the forensic findings, Olson's demeanor shifted. He didn't panic. He didn't confess. Instead, he made an offer. "I know where they all are," he said, "but you're going to have to pay me for it." Faced with increasing pressure from families and a growing sense of urgency, authorities made a decision that would haunt Canada for decades. They negotiated. Clifford Olson demanded money in exchange for revealing the locations of victims' remains. The logic was brutal and tragic. Families deserved answers. Children deserved to be found and given proper burials. But the cost was devastating. Over the course of several weeks, authorities agreed to pay Olson $100,000, $10,000 for each victim's location. The money was to be held in trust for his wife and infant son. To Olson, this was proof. Proof that he was in control. Proof that police needed him. Proof that suffering could be turned into currency. As Olson led investigators to grave sites, each discovery confirmed the worst fears. Parents received confirmation, but not closure. And Clifford Olson, handcuffed and surrounded by officers, smiled. He believed he had won, but he was wrong. Because while Olson thought he was controlling the narrative, he was also building the case that would ensure he never saw freedom again. The game was ending, and soon, Clifford Olson would face the full weight of justice. For years, Clifford Olson believed he was untouchable. He believed police needed him. He believed he controlled the flow of information. He believed he was smarter than everyone in the room. But control is fragile, and once it cracks, it collapses quickly. By the time investigators finished verifying Olson's claims, They no longer saw him as a bargaining partner. They saw him as evidence. The leverage he thought he possessed was gone, and for the first time, Clifford Olson was not dictating the terms. August 1981 marked the beginning of the end. Olson had agreed to lead police to the locations of his victims in exchange for payment. But what he didn't realize was that every word he spoke, every location he revealed, every detail he provided was being meticulously documented. He believed he was negotiating. In reality, he was confessing. And Canadian law enforcement was ensuring that every piece of information would be admissible in court. Between August 12th and August 25th, 1981, Clifford Olson led police on what would later be called confession tours. Accompanied by RCMP officers, Crown prosecutors, and forensic specialists, Olson directed investigators to remote locations across British Columbia. Each trip followed the same disturbing pattern. Olson would sit in the back of an unmarked police vehicle, sometimes handcuffed, sometimes not. He would give directions calmly, as if guiding someone to a tourist attraction. Turn left here. Drive about 2 kilometers. Look for the dirt road near the logging site. When they arrived at each location, Olson would describe what had happened there. Not with remorse, not with hesitation, but with clinical detachment. He spoke about his victims as if discussing objects. He referred to them by physical descriptions rather than names. He described their final moments without emotion. The first location, Christine Weller. The first site Olson led investigators to was near Surrey, British Columbia. He directed them to a wooded area off a side road, a location that had already been searched months earlier during the initial investigation into Christine Weller's disappearance. "She's over there," Olson said, pointing toward a cluster of trees. "You probably walked right past her before." Forensic teams began excavating. Within hours, they uncovered remains that were later confirmed to be Christine Weller, the 12-year-old girl who had disappeared in November 1980. This discovery was significant for several reasons. First, it confirmed that Olson's information was accurate. He knew details that only the perpetrator could know. Second, it revealed that Olson had been operating for far longer than police initially suspected. Christine's disappearance predated the summer 1981 cases by nearly 8 months. Third, it demonstrated Olson's confidence. He had returned to this area multiple times, knowing that investigators had already searched it. He believed he was too clever to be caught. Subsequent locations. Over the following 2 weeks, Olson led police to 10 additional sites. Each location was remote. Each required detailed knowledge of backroads, logging trails, and isolated areas. Some sites were near popular camping areas, but far enough off main trails that they would never have been discovered without precise directions. Others were in heavily wooded regions that required officers to hike significant distances. At each site, forensic teams worked carefully to recover remains and gather evidence. And at each site, Clifford Olson watched. Officers later reported that Olson seemed energized by the process. He asked questions about forensic techniques. He commented on police procedures. He seemed fascinated by the attention. One investigator recalled, "He acted like he was teaching a class, like he wanted us to be impressed by what he'd done. There was no shame, no guilt, just pride." While Olson was leading investigators to grave sites, the legal process was moving forward. Crown prosecutors knew they would need more than confessions. They needed to establish Olson's mental state, his capacity to understand right from wrong, and his fitness to stand trial. In September 1981, Clifford Olson underwent a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Roy O'Shaughnessy, a forensic psychiatrist, was assigned to assess Olson's mental state. Over the course of several sessions, Dr. O'Shaughnessy conducted interviews, administered psychological tests, and reviewed Olson's extensive criminal history. His findings were chilling. Key findings from the evaluation. 1. No evidence of psychosis. Olson was not experiencing delusions, hallucinations, or breaks from reality. He understood the nature of his actions and could distinguish between right and wrong. 2. Severe antisocial personality disorder. Olson exhibited classic traits of psychopathy: complete lack of empathy, superficial charm, pathological lying, grandiose sense of self-worth, manipulative behavior, no remorse or guilt. 3. High intelligence. Psychological testing revealed that Olson possessed above-average intelligence. He was articulate, strategic, and capable of long-term planning. This finding was significant because it contradicted any potential defense argument that Olson was intellectually incapable of understanding his actions. 4. Fit to stand trial. Dr. O'Shaughnessy concluded that Olson was fully capable of understanding the charges against him, participating in his own defense, and comprehending the legal process. Most importantly, the evaluation confirmed what investigators already suspected. Clifford Olson knew exactly what he was doing. He chose to do it anyway, and he felt no remorse. With Olson's confessions documented and his mental competency established, Crown prosecutors began building their case. They faced a unique challenge. On one hand, they had overwhelming evidence: confessions, forensic findings, witness statements, and physical evidence linking Olson to multiple crime scenes. On the other hand, they had to address the controversial payment: the $100,000 payment controversy. The decision to pay Clifford Olson for information sparked immediate public outrage. Citizens were horrified. How could the government negotiate with someone who had harmed children? How could taxpayer money be used to compensate a criminal? Legal experts debated the ethics and legality of the arrangement. Some argued it was necessary. Without Olson's cooperation, families would never have received answers. Victims would never have been found. Closure would have remained impossible. Others argued it set a dangerous precedent. It suggested that criminals could profit from their crimes. It turned justice into a transaction. The controversy became a national debate. Crown prosecutors addressed this concern directly. They clarified several important points. The money was not payment for confession. Under Canadian law, such an arrangement would be illegal and inadmissible in court. The money was structured as payment for information leading to the recovery of remains. This framing was legally distinct from paying for testimony. The money was placed in trust for Olson's wife and son, not given directly to Olson himself. The confessions obtained during the process were voluntary and made in the presence of legal counsel. This ensured they would be admissible as evidence. Despite these clarifications, public anger remained, and that anger would eventually lead to legislative change. On January 14, 1982, Clifford Olson was formally charged with 11 counts of first-degree murder. The victims were Christine Weller, 12, Colleen Daignault, 13, Darren Johnsrud, 16, Sandra Wolfsteiner, 16, Ada Court, 13, Simon Partington, 9, Judy Cosma, 14, Raymond King Jr., 15, Sigrun Arndt, 18, Terry Lynn Carson, 15, Louise Chartrand, 17. Each charge carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment. But in Canada, life imprisonment did not necessarily mean life. Under the law at the time, offenders could apply for parole after serving 25 years. This fact would become critically important later. The trial of Clifford Olson began on January 11, 1982, in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, Olson's legal team made a strategic decision. He would plead guilty. This was not an act of remorse, it was a calculation. By pleading guilty, Olson avoided a lengthy trial. He avoided having to sit through weeks of testimony. He avoided cross-examination. And perhaps most importantly to him, he controlled the narrative. He decided how much information would be made public. The guilty plea. On January 14, 1982, Clifford Olson stood before Justice Harry Mackay and entered guilty pleas to all 11 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with family members of the victims. Many wept openly as the charges were read. Olson showed no emotion. Justice Mackay addressed him directly. "Clifford Robert Olson, you have pleaded guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder. These are among the most serious crimes known to our legal system. Do you understand the gravity of these charges?" Olson replied, "Yes, Your Honor." There was no elaboration, no statement of remorse, no acknowledgement of the families in the courtroom, just a simple, detached confirmation. Victim impact statements. Although victim impact statements were not as formalized in 1982 as they are today, several family members were given the opportunity to speak. One father stood and addressed the court. "My daughter was taken from us. She was just a child. She trusted adults. She believed the world was safe. And this man took advantage of that trust. He destroyed our family. He destroyed our lives. No sentence can bring her back. But I hope the court ensures he never has the opportunity to harm anyone else." Another mother spoke through tears. "I wake up every morning, and for a moment I forget. And then I remember. And I have to live with that pain every single day. This man showed no mercy to our children. I ask that the court show no mercy to him." Clifford Olson listened without visible reaction. When given the opportunity to address the court himself, he declined. On January 14, 1982, Justice Harry Mackay delivered the sentence. "Clifford Robert Olson, you have been found guilty of 11 counts of first-degree murder. The law requires that I impose a sentence of life imprisonment for each count. These sentences will run concurrently." In Canadian law, this meant Olson would serve a single life sentence, regardless of the number of victims. Justice Mackay continued, "Under current law, you will be eligible to apply for parole after serving 25 years. However, I am recommending to the National Parole Board that you never be released. Your crimes demonstrate a complete absence of remorse, a profound danger to society, and a level of cruelty that shocks the conscience." He then added, "You are, in my assessment, beyond rehabilitation. The safety of the public requires that you remain incarcerated for the remainder of your natural life." The sentence was final. Clifford Olson was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. For the first time in years, he was no longer in control. The conviction brought relief to some families, but the controversy surrounding the $100,000 payment continued to dominate public discourse. Newspapers across Canada ran editorials condemning the arrangement. Citizens organized protests. Politicians faced pressure to address the issue. The phrase "blood money" became common in media coverage. One editorial in the Vancouver Sun stated, "While we understand the desperation of investigators to bring closure to grieving families, we cannot accept that justice can be purchased. This arrangement sets a precedent that undermines the integrity of our legal system." The controversy reached Parliament. In response to public outcry, lawmakers began drafting legislation that would prevent criminals from profiting from notoriety. The resulting law, informally known as Clifford Olson's Law, was passed in 1983. The Son of Sam Law, Canadian version. The legislation prohibited criminals from receiving payment for information about their crimes, profiting from books, interviews, or media appearances related to their offenses, transferring criminal proceeds to family members. The law ensured that no one else could use suffering as currency the way Clifford Olson had. This was perhaps the greatest irony. In trying to control history, Olson reshaped it in a way that stripped power from people like him forever. Clifford Olson was initially incarcerated at the British Columbia Penitentiary in New Westminster. Later, he was transferred to the maximum security Kingston Penitentiary in Ontario, where he would spend the majority of his sentence. Prison did not humble Clifford Olson. He continued to seek attention through every available channel. Letters and lawsuits. Olson was a prolific letter writer. He sent correspondence to journalists, politicians, lawyers, victims' families, other inmates. In his letters, Olson often attempted to maintain his narrative of control. He complained about prison conditions. He threatened lawsuits. He made grandiose claims about his treatment. He filed dozens of lawsuits against correctional authorities, alleging everything from poor medical care to violations of his rights. None of these lawsuits were successful. Inside prison, Clifford Olson was universally despised. Even among incarcerated populations, where criminal behavior is normalized, those who harm children occupy the lowest status. Olson was frequently isolated for his own protection. He was denied access to general population due to credible threats against his life. Guards described him as manipulative and disruptive. One former correctional officer recalled, "He tried to play games with everyone. He'd file complaints, make accusations, try to create divisions between staff. He wanted attention. He wanted to feel important. But mostly, people just wanted him to shut up." Without an audience, his power meant nothing. As the years passed, Clifford Olson's health began to decline. In 2010, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was transferred to a regional treatment center within the correctional system, where he received palliative care. Even in his final months, Olson attempted to maintain relevance. He gave interviews from his hospital bed. He wrote letters claiming he had information about other unsolved cases. He hinted at additional victims. Investigators looked into these claims. They found no credible evidence. It was a final attempt at manipulation, a last effort to remain the center of attention. It failed. On September 30th, 2011, Clifford Olson died in prison at the age of 71. There were no mourners, no tributes, no public memorial. His death was announced in a brief press release from Correctional Service Canada. Media coverage was minimal. For the families of his victims, his death brought complicated emotions. Some felt relief. Others felt nothing. A few expressed that no amount of suffering on his part could balance what he had taken. Years passed, public attention faded. And for someone like Olson, that silence was punishment. He had spent his entire life seeking control, seeking attention, seeking to be seen as powerful. But history had other plans. He died in prison in 2011. There were no mourners, no tributes, no legacy worth preserving. History did not remember him as powerful. It remembered him as a warning. A warning about what happens when systems fail to recognize danger, when warning signs are ignored, when someone is allowed to believe they are untouchable. But this story is not about Clifford Olson. Not really. This story is about the children who should still be alive, the families who carry grief every single day, and the society that learned, painfully, what it means to protect the vulnerable. For the families of the victims, there was no clean ending. No sentence, no law, no prison term could undo the loss. Parents grew older without their children. Siblings grew up without brothers and sisters. Entire futures disappeared. True crime often focuses on perpetrators. But the real impact lives with the families who wake up every day to an absence that never fades. This is why stories like this matter. not to sensationalize violence, but to remember the cost. Offenders often seek immortality. They believe their names will live on. They want to be remembered. The most meaningful act of resistance is to deny them that focus, and instead remember the people they tried to erase. Names matter, because names restore humanity. They remind us that these were not stories or cases or statistics. They were children. They had favorite foods. They had dreams. They had inside jokes with their friends. They had plans for the future. They were loved. And they are still loved. When we say their names, we acknowledge that their lives had value. When we say their names, we refuse to let their identities be consumed by the person who harmed them. When we say their names, we honor the people they were, and the people they could have become. Before this documentary ends, we pause, not for Clifford Olson, but for the lives he took. In loving memory of Christine Weller, 12, born 1968, disappeared November 17, 1980, found December 25, 1980. Christine was described by her family as warm, kind, and thoughtful. She loved spending time with her friends and had a bright smile that lit up every room. She was just beginning to discover her interests and talents when her life was tragically cut short. Her family remembers her for the joy she brought into their lives. Colleen Degnault, 13, disappeared April 16, 1981. Colleen was a bright, creative young girl who loved art and music. Her family remembers her laughter and her curiosity about the world. She had dreams of becoming a teacher. Those dreams were stolen, but her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her. Darren Johnsrud, 16, disappeared April 22, 1981. Darren was an active, outgoing teenager who loved sports and the outdoors. He was known for his sense of humor and his loyalty to his friends. His parents remember him as a son who made them proud every day. His absence left a void that can never be filled. Sandra Wolfsteiner, 16, disappeared May 19, 1981. Sandra was on the cusp of adulthood, full of hope and possibility. She had plans for her future and people who cared deeply about her. Her life was taken far too soon, but she is remembered with love by those who knew her. Ada Court, 13, disappeared June 21, 1981. Ada was a gentle, caring young girl who loved animals and nature. Her family describes her as someone who always saw the good in people. She deserved to grow up, to experience life, to become the person she was meant to be. Her memory is cherished. Simon Partington, 9, disappeared July 2, 1981. Simon was only 9 years old, a child whose life had barely begun. He loved playing outside, riding his bike, and spending time with his family. He was full of energy and innocence. His death is a reminder of how devastating this loss truly was. He is remembered with profound love. Judy Cosma, 14, disappeared July 9, 1981. Judy was responsible, kind, and protective of her younger siblings. She had a strong sense of right and wrong and was trusted by her family. She was taken from a world that needed more people like her. Her family continues to honor her memory through advocacy and service. Raymond King Jr., 15, disappeared July 23, 1981. Known to his friends as Ray, he was an athletic, outgoing teenager who loved sports and spending time outdoors. He was looking forward to his future and had so much potential. His family remembers him as a son who brought joy and pride into their lives. Sigrun Arnd, 18, disappeared July 25, 1981. Sigrun was a young woman from Germany, visiting Canada to learn English and experience a new culture. She was adventurous, curious, and full of life. Her family across the ocean mourned her loss deeply. She came to Canada seeking opportunity and adventure. Instead, her life was taken. She deserved so much more. Terry Lynn Carson, 15, disappeared July 27, 1981. Terry was a vibrant, spirited teenager with her whole life ahead of her. She had friends who loved her and a family that cherished her. Her absence is felt every day by those who knew her. She is remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived. Louise Chartrand, 17, disappeared August 12, 1981. Louise was on the edge of adulthood, full of dreams and plans for her future. She was the last known victim, taken just days before Olson was arrested. Her family wonders what she could have accomplished, who she could have become. They carry her memory with love and sorrow. Each of these names represents a life that mattered, a future that should have existed. A reminder that the true tragedy of this story is not the man who committed the crimes. It is the children who never had the chance to grow up.
In the years following the trial, many of the victims' families became advocates for change. They refused to let their children's deaths be meaningless. They worked with lawmakers to strengthen victims' rights legislation. They volunteered with organizations dedicated to child safety and missing persons cases. They spoke at schools, community centers, and conferences about the importance of awareness and prevention. Their advocacy led to expanded victim services across Canada, improved coordination between law enforcement agencies, better public education about child safety, stronger legal protections for victims and their families. One mother said, "I can't bring my daughter back, but I can work to make sure other parents don't have to go through what we went through. That's the only way I can honor her memory." This is the real legacy of this case. Not the infamy of one man, but the strength of the families who refused to be silenced. The Clifford Olson case forced Canada to confront uncomfortable truths about its criminal justice system. What went wrong? Repeated early release, despite warnings. Olson had been arrested over 90 times before his final crimes. Yet he was repeatedly released on parole. The system failed to recognize the escalating danger he posed. Telling stories like this comes with responsibility. To avoid glorification, to avoid sensationalism, to focus on truth, context, and impact. Understanding how predators operate helps prevent future harm. Understanding how systems can fail helps us build better protections. Remembering victims restores dignity. This balance matters because the goal is not fear. The goal is awareness. We tell these stories not to traumatize, but to educate. Not to glorify violence, but to honor those who were lost. Not to give power to those who harmed, but to give voice to those who were silenced. This is the responsibility of true crime content done right. And it's a responsibility that must never be taken lightly. Clifford Olson wanted control. He wanted attention. He wanted to be remembered. But history does not belong to him. It belongs to Christine, Colleen, Darren, Sandra, Ada, Simon, Judy, Raymond, Sigrun, Terry, and Louise. It belongs to the children whose names we carry forward. And if there is meaning to be found in telling this story, it is here. In remembrance, in accountability, and in the refusal to forget who truly mattered. These children were not just victims. They were people. They laughed, they dreamed, they loved and were loved. And though their lives were cut short, their memory endures. Not because of the man who took them, but because of the families who refuse to let them be forgotten. Because of the advocates who fight for change in their names. Because of the communities that learn to protect their children better. And because of every person who hears this story and says, never again.
You've just watched Downfall: Inside the Criminal Mind. Coming next, Paul Bernardo, The Suburban Nightmare.